Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Thursday morning, so should be enough time for everybody to get their questions in, but let's jump in and see what we got. First up, over on Floatplane, Amin said the event Pixel Party in the Faroe Islands was a great success. They had the event in an alcohol-free bar called Hollywood, where they hauled in most of the CRTs left in the Faroes and some early LCDs with low input latency for Halo 4 vs 4 on OG Xbox and for supersonic aerobatic rocket-powered battle cars on PS3. They also had Smash Bros. Ultimate running on a projector on a 100-inch screen. The nonprofit organization Blue Cross, which helps people with alcohol and substance issues, own the bar and have put photos and videos up from the event on their youth site on Instagram. 0.2% of the population attended the event, around 110 people. They've been asked to arrange this again in the winter, so that's nice. Do I have any tips for storing and transporting consoles and CRTs safely? One of their CRTs died mid event, and a power supply for the NES got fried. So first of all, that's really awesome to hear. This was the event that they were talking about a couple months ago, and I'm so glad it happened, and I'm so glad it was a success. And it's a very cool story. I'll leave a link to the Instagram post for everybody. But to the advice, do I have any tips for storing and transporting consoles and CRTs safely? So the very basics: protect the screen, protect the back of it, because very often a CRT could fall over onto its glass and depending on how and where it falls, meaning like tip over onto its glass, might not ruin it. Whereas if it falls onto its back, the plastic rear could just push that neck board right in. So the back, I would say, is equally as fragile as the front for those. So support those properly. And for consoles, same thing. You just don't want everything bouncing around and getting scratched. The only other thing I might note is just, what's the environment like? Are you putting it in a metal storage container where it's going to be, 200 degrees in the baking sun? Are you putting it in a shed somewhere where lots of spiders and bugs could go in? The last thing you want to do is have a CRT where you bring it to an event, plop it down, and 100 roaches scatter everywhere. So just the very basics of storage, and the only thing CRT console specific would be the neck board and the screen, and then of course ultra high humidity, or I guess even really dry, is not the greatest thing for capacitors. But those are just kind of the overall basics. One CRT died mid-event. That's going to happen. Unless you recapped and calibrated every single CRT, checked with the CRT rejuvenator, not ran the rejuvenation, but just checked to make sure that it was in good standing condition. And even then, it could have still died mid event because it's 30, 40 years old. So that's a roll of the dice. Power supply for the NES got fried. So I am starting to see more and more often OEM power supplies go bad. And I've had two SNES PSUs go bad. One kept popping fuses randomly. Like sometimes the console wouldn't turn on, sometimes it would pop the fuse. The other one that just happened was sometimes it wouldn't turn the console on, but sometimes I would get horizontal diagonal noise. And I lost over an hour of screenshot time the other day trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. And I don't know how or why. I think I switched to a Super Famicom instead of a Super Nintendo. And I plugged in the Triad power supply I had, and I just went, wait a minute. And I grabbed the SNES Triad power supply, and everything went away. And I plugged the original SNES back in, and everything came back. So for my carts that I have here, and especially for my testing that I do, I'm no longer going to be using OEM. I'm only going to be using triads. And I always got to throw this disclaimer in there. They're not the best power supplies on the planet, but they're consistently great, and they're good priced, but the consistency is the thing. The power supply triad that I bought 5 years ago and the power supply that I bought a month and a half ago are identical in performance. And that's the thing that's most important to me. Also, I don't know if you could possibly ever see a difference between a triad and what somebody might rate as a perfect power supply. I just don't think it's going to be noticeable on a scope with your eyes, with gameplay. There's it definitely reaches a point where it's overkill. So I'm a fan of those without a doubt. But so I guess that would be the only other advice is if you start to see power supplies die, get a bunch of triads and don't cheap out with that like old school brand or any power supply with suspicious looking consumer electronics ratings that weigh in, less than an ounce, that I would definitely point you in that direction. But other than that, sounds awesome. Really glad the event went well. And let me know if there's anything else I could do, any other tips or advice or anything. Next is kind of a fun one from Mike. A couple of weeks back, they rented a car and there was a large amount of delay between hitting the throttle and the car actually responding to the input. How would I go about testing the input lag of an accelerator pedal in a car? Well, first of all, I've always been a wannabe gearhead. I've loved cars since the first time I saw Knight Rider when I was a really little kid. I'm pretty sure I learned how to tell time because of Knight Rider. My first memory of looking at a clock was trying to figure out when Knight Rider was coming on, so I had to figure out how to read a clock. But so I've always loved cars, and I've actually had this discussion quite a few times recently. And if anybody doesn't know, around the 2000s, cars stopped having the accelerator pedal go from a linkage directly to the fuel injectors or carburetor if your car was older than that. Um, Up until that point, though, when you stepped on the accelerator, the linkage cable would pull a lever that said how much fuel you wanted to be, fuel and air you wanted to put in. And around the 2000s, that was moved to all digital control, which could assist with quite a lot of different things that I'm not going to get into. And I never noticed any input lag on those cars. In fact, the truck that I recently had to get rid of, pour one out for Blue 2000 Ford Ranger. I miss that thing every single day, but that had no input latency, even though there definitely was not, it was some kind of digital acceleration. But as computers control cars more and more and more, I found that quite a bit. Now, one of the things that people who explain to me is that it might not actually be delay. It might be that a car who has an engine that's kind of underpowered for what you're doing, you hit the gas real quick and not, floor it trying to launch, but, light turns green, you tap the pedal, and there's actually a delay because the engine's just trying to catch up with itself. So you get that like pause as if you didn't hit it and then kind of lurch forward a little bit type of thing. But there is absolutely input latency in certain cases. The one that really bothered me, and I don't know why, because this should be more of a good thing than a bad thing, but I ended up leasing the cheapest car on the planet, and it was a lemon. So they dealership gave me a loaner, and in the loaner car, it had kind of a cool thing where when you put the blinker on the dashboard, which was an all digital dash, if you press your left blinker instead of the tack, you would see a camera that shows you what's on the left side of your car. And if you flipped it to the right instead of the speedometer, you'd see a camera that showed you on your right, and then the speed reading would still be there, kind of hovering in the bottom. And at first, I was like, this is absolutely awesome. Except if you think about it, you're driving down the road, you go to merge, you're on the highway, a car's coming at you because, so many terrible drivers out there. So you hit your blinker and you turn, and you look in your mirror at the same time. It's like an instant thing. And I immediately was reminded of gamers and what we go through in the gaming world. So you flip the blinker on, your brain isn't going, stop, put on your blinker, look to the left, turn, look back. Like, it is instantaneous. Your whole body, especially if you think there's a dangerous situation, everything's heightened. So it's like, look, go. But there was a solid 1 to 2 second delay from the time you flipped the blinker to the time the camera came on. So it ended up being more of a distraction, because in a situation like that, I'd flip it, I'd look in the mirror, and I'd look to the side real quick, and then I'd look down, and then the camera would pop up. So it seems like a lot of stuff in cars these days are tested in not realistic scenarios. And there was a bunch of stuff about the new cars that drove me nuts. Like, one of the ones, all the time I end up having to back my car to the garage to get to stuff, because I have a very small house, and my New York City tricks, every square inch is used for storage. So I'll hop in the car, I'll put it in reverse, I'll back up, I'll do something in the garage, I'll pull it back in, and I don't put my seatbelt on because I'm backing the car out 3 feet. So, no need for that. But now I'll get in the car, I'll put it in reverse, and the car will lock up and it won't go anywhere until I put my seatbelt on. So think about that. I have worked for places where I had to go on site in some pretty bad areas. And in fact, one of the medical companies that we were doing work for, I'd have to go on site to their clinics. And there were quite a few times where I was walking out to my car and there was some twitchy crackhead looking person. And I just walked straight to my car, got in, and left. I didn't run, I didn't panic, but I didn't screw around either. And a couple times they got pretty close. And maybe they were just asking for money, or maybe they were trying to bop me over the head to get their oxy money or whatever. But if I were in one of these newer cars and I put it in reverse and the car locked up, you have to set it to park, put your seatbelt on. Sometimes you have to, if it's the digital push button, you might have to restart the car. Like if I was getting attacked, I would have gotten absolutely assaulted by the time that happened. And there's so many things like that. Also, like if you're rolling forward, anybody ever roll forward and open their door to see how if they're over the line parking? Because I hate people who park badly, and I get embarrassed when I do. So I'll roll forward and I'll open the door and I'll be like, okay, and I'll go to move the car. And as soon as you open the door, everything locks up and it goes into park. And it's like, I'm not driving down the road at 10 miles an hour. I'm inching less than 1 mile an hour, inching up, just trying to aim it properly. And it's, yeah. So all of that stuff, the input lag was a huge problem, but also the overall, they're testing it in these happy areas where stuff like input lag doesn't matter. I'm sure in their little test things, they're like, okay, we're going to put on our blinker, make sure our hands are at 10 and 2, and then we'll glance our eyes down to check the camera. Like, that's not how driving works, just like my other two examples that I just used. So I don't know how you'd go about testing it other than doing exactly, 5 minutes later, 6 minutes that I've been ranting about shit that you didn't ask. Sorry, Mike. But to actually answer your question, I would test it exactly the way you did, but I would, in your brain, have it be high stress environment, right? So, you're going down the road at the speed limit, and all of a sudden you see a car about to blow a stop sign. So you slam on the gas, and if you slam on the gas and it goes like my crappy Kia Soul used to do, probably don't want that car because, that thing might not get out of the way in time. So, yeah, I don't know. Sorry for the long rant, but you really struck a nerve here. And I got footage of all the things I talked about because one of these days, if I ever have 1 second of free time, I would love to do an entire video talking about how I ended up with a lemon, how I almost got totally screwed over because of that, and all of the crazy stuff I found in the newer cars that are supposed to be safety issues, but in many, many cases end up being potential dangerous hazards. So, yeah, let me know. If I talk too long about this and you never want to hear me ramble about it again, let me know. And I won't, because this has nothing to do with retro gaming. This was me, just Mike having a fun question that sparked me to ramble. My bad. Now, moving over to Patreon, the Remora said they recently purchased the dual band Wi-Fi and Bluetooth adapter I had listed in the Amazon store, and they wanted to share that it did not work initially. They had to get a powered USB hub out because the Mister was not supplying enough power for it to even show up. It now works perfectly fine. So, always have had issues with that one. I left a link on the Mister page warning, or I left a note on the Mister page warning about that. I still have it in my Amazon store because sometimes it does work, but I have tried everything to get it to work consistently. I've tried using a triad power supply with way more amperage than I would need, just to make sure. And just remember, amps are pulled by the source, not sent to it. So you can't blow something out by having a power supply that could potentially supply more amperage. So I've tried power, I've tried external hubs, I've tried every combination of anything that you could imagine. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There was a Mister update that caused it to not work for a while. And then after another update, it started working again. And I tried reporting this to the Mister team, but they couldn't really reproduce it. So it's not their fault if they can't reproduce it, but myself and a bunch of other people could. So maybe there's a bunch of different model revisions of the dual band Wi-Fi adapters. I don't know. So I do appreciate very much you letting me know that just adding a powered hub helped, but I don't know. I'll keep trying, and I could give that a shot as well. But all of the cases I've tried from every vendor, as long as you use, as long as you're using a proper power supply, it'll still not connect every now and then. And I just don't understand why or how I can get it to work better. The one thing I have definitely tried is if you turn it on and it doesn't connect, I just unplug it or wait like 10 seconds, plug it back in, and I just leave it up. And sometimes it takes like 2 full minutes for it to register and connect. But also sometimes even the Ethernet will take a full minute before it gets an IP address. So yeah, keep them coming if you have any tips or things that you want me to try. But I just, I'm not sure if we're ever going to really find a solution for this, because I can't consistently make it fail, and neither can the people in the Mystery team that I've talked to. So it's no one's fault. We just got to try to figure it out together. So keep them coming. Next up, K2 recently purchased a Haas Supergun and have some questions on video output. They bought both the 8-pin mini DIN to SCART and HD15 adapters sold on the Haas store. So their pure RGB is covered, but what about S-Video and Composite for their consumer TV sets? Are there any transcoders for this that you would recommend? Maybe something that you could also use with your open MVS. So, yes, but the one from Retro Castle is still coming. There were some manufacturing issues, not with the design, to be specific. The manufacturer itself was the problem. And that's the one that has the variable capacitor. So you plug in your RGB cable, it's got composite and S-Video out, and you could just dial in the variable cap until it looks right. I've found that you don't need a test pattern for that. Firing up a game that you know sort of well, you don't have to be as somebody that's done deep analysis, but pick a game that you know, load up the first level and spin that variable cap until it looks best. And it's like a clock. It's not infinite. So once you pass 1, 1, 2, 3 goes to 12 and then back to 1. So you could just spin that thing and try to find the best spot. And it's not going to look exactly like native composite, but in many cases, it should look good enough where you would rather do that than a lot of the other solutions. S-Video output's always going to be good with those solutions. Once again, not as good as native S-Video output, but it's going to be fine. There are some issues with how the Neo Geo generates its signal and conversion to composite. Quan from ArcadeWorks had to use the older 1145 Sony chips for this exact reason, because the newer ones wouldn't do a composite conversion properly. So you might run into issues there, but that's the one I would wait for. And I apologize because I've been saying that for like a year. And I'm always the person that says, don't wait if there's something else out there. But there really just isn't anybody else who's doing the variable cap trick for that on an external device. So I would wait for that. I'll follow up with Ivory again just to see. Hopefully he got some manufacturing issues sorted. But this is really one of these products where at first people are going to be like, why do I need this? And why is it expensive? Because it's not going to be $20. It's probably going to be 50 or more. I'm guessing, by the way, just guessing. But there are always going to be scenarios like this where people go, oh crap, I could really use that. Or the person who just got an entire RGB SCART setup, they're running through a Tink 4K, everything's awesome, and then they stumble across the perfect 32-inch CRT for light gun games that's composite only, and they go, well, what do I do now? My entire setup's already RGB C-Sync. Throw one of these in the mix and you're good to go. So good question, but I would hold off for that. And the moment those are available, I will be posting and at the very least doing a live stream, but I'd love to do a video demoing it, even if it's only a 5-minuter, which when are my videos that short these days? But because I just think there's so many scenarios in which I think there's an equal amount of scenarios in which people would go, cool product, useless for me, as there are people that'll go, oh, wow, that actually solves a couple issues in my setup. So hopefully I'll be able to do that as soon as it gets released. Next up, Adam Ant has a couple of Genesis triple bypass questions. First, they just did their first triple bypass mod on a Model 1 Genesis. It looks and sounds great. They tried to hook the headphone port to it where Zaxor's guide said to do it, and it did work, but they started to get a hum on the TV and the headphones. Is there a good way to cancel that out, or should they just disconnect the headphone jack since they'll probably never use it anyway? Time is the thing that I have the least of. So my answer to you, which is not the right answer, but my answer is if you don't think you're going to need it, disconnect it. And if you ever have extra time and you're just curious, go back and troubleshoot. Is there a short somewhere? Grab a magnifying glass and double check. Maybe one of the ground is touching one of the signals somewhere. Where did you run that wire? Is that wire potentially touching something else? Did you use a shielded wire? That's one of the things I show in the guide is I cut an old headphone cable that has the individually shielded wires. So you would put left and right, and then you ground that both of those ground points to something. That's also a big thing to try. But if you follow the guide exactly the way Zaxor said to do it, and you're using shielded cables, and then I don't really know. I would just double check to see there's no shorts, but you could end up just spending a lot of time on this. And if you don't use the headphone jack, I don't know. I would just leave like a post-it note with some non-abrasive double-sided scotch tape on the bottom, where you could just leave a note that says headphone jack disabled. So, and triple bypass installed, no composite or whatever, because there's so many mods out there that I'm just afraid people are eventually going to get, and they're going to plug in a composite cable and go, oh, doesn't work, and throw it in the garbage, not realizing they have a beautifully modded triple bypass Genesis. So next, part of doing the triple bypass was to get a great looking and sounding tower of power. There's an AV cable that goes between the 32X and the Genesis. Should that cable be as well built as an HD RetroVision cable? Yeah, I'll leave a link to the 32X section. It explains all of that. You need to get them from the proper vendors. If that's unshielded, it's going to introduce a bunch of interference. The only other thing that I would just warn you about is the 32X itself generates some noise. So if you like to have your tower of power always connected, what I would do is just double check. I would go direct out of the Genesis into your scaler, TV, whatever, and see how it looks, and then play that same Genesis game or Sega CD game with the 32X connected and see if you have noticeable added interference. And if you do, it might be best to leave the 32X unplugged. Check that you're using good power supplies. That Tower of Power kit, that the Triad kit should be fine for all of that stuff. And if you've just bought a low quality link cable to go between the Genesis and 32X, that could be it as well. I wouldn't personally obsess about that, but if you have a scenario where there's a noticeable difference, like you don't need a side by side comparison, you could just plug it in with the 32X and go, wow, that's definitely worse. I'd consider leaving it off or just double checking everything else. But yeah, that's the only other thing to note. But I've had both. I've had 32Xs that looked fine, and I've had ones that totally didn't. Both were recapped, refurbished, double checked. So those little mushroom turds never really worked right. Next up, Dustin Madison recently got hooked on a website called Suno AI, where you could make songs using AI based on a brief description. So they've been playing around and made 2 versions of a theme song royalty free. I laughed out loud when I heard him, which I'm really sorry if that wasn't your goal. I apologize. I just thought it was very funny to hear that with an AI generated thing. So I'll leave links if people want to hear them, but that's pretty neat. But for my own theme songs, I'll stick to using the songs that I wrote because ego, just being honest. Next up, Oliver Clare is wondering what my go-to recommendation for a G-SCART switch alternative would be. They need to swap out the G-SCART from their retro cart into their permanent setup, and they want to get a new SCART switch for the cart. So the Games Care switch was pretty cool. I liked that one. I'm not sure if it's in stock. I think they're kind of working on getting stock rebuilt at the moment. For a cheap basic one, the retro gaming cable switch was absolutely awesome, especially when you consider price. It's just a push button, 1-out switch. So if you had that for your cart and you didn't need to access more, I would definitely say that one, just because why spend all this extra money when you could save a whole bunch? But there was no interference. The only downside is you just have to manually push a button to select which console you want to use. And there's a couple others that I've seen being advertised. There's those modular switches that a couple people are talking about. Jan from Consoles for You, Arithmus are both showing theirs. And then there's also another 16-port SCART switch that I have a prototype of that seemed fine. I have to really double dig in because when it's a 16-port, it's a lot more circuitry to go wrong. But that might be coming soon, and that has potential to be great. So if your main setup, you could really benefit from a 16 port instead of an 8, leave your G-SCART where it is and hang out for a little bit. I don't think that's months away. I don't think that's years away. I think that's months away, because, anytime you put anything into manufacturing, it's like 3 months. So maybe by the end of the year, that one will be out and ready to purchase. But so far, that one seemed kind of cool. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but for cost and performance reasons, my number one go-to is the retro gaming cables one, just because it's cheap and it works fine. So that one's the go-to. Obviously, G-SCARTs have been around forever, and they really have stood the test of time. So if you find a used one for cheap, not scalped on eBay for insane amounts of money, that's a great one. And the Games Care I liked as well, and I'm sure there was others that I've just forgotten about. My apologies. I don't really recommend the otaku ones anymore just because the consistency is not there at all for anything. The revision consistency, performance consistency, and especially not communication consistency. So I just don't really recommend those unless you have no other choice. So, and if you do buy that, you might want to use AliExpress or a place that could track it. So if you buy it and through 2 months you don't get a shipping notification, you could get your money back. So sorry to be brutal about that, but I mean, that's years of complaints. So not mine, like years of hearing everybody else's complaints. So hopefully the otaku store got their stuff figured out. But yeah, that's my recommendations. I'll drop a link to the SCART page. And as soon as as soon as I'm allowed to talk about more info on that other one, I'll let you all know. But the 16 port one is looking good so far, but I don't even have a price. For all I know, it's a gazillion dollars. So we'll see whenever that eventually is finished. Next up, Wyrock wants to know if I ever get into different moods for what kinds of scanlines I like to use. Here recently, they've been really enjoying the LCD scanlines with optimal sampling on the Tink 5X, where each pixel has its own little box. GBA was the main use case, of course, but they've even been using it for stuff like N64 and GameCube as well. Silliest thing they've been doing is putting their Switch in 480p, routing it through the Tink, and then using the LCD scanlines. It feels silly, but it's honestly a neat effect for some Switch stuff like Pokemon Arceus, which has some crazy aliasing in a lot of places. Do I have always have a per console preference, or does my mood for them change with the seasons? Great question, and I'm mostly on your page where different things have different fits. So my eyes have always preferred the look of a Trinitron tube, an aperture grill tube. So I will very often go after that scanline look for everything: TV, movies, video games. However, Neo Geo always looks right on the Shadow Mask tubes because the only time I ever played Neo Geo as a kid was in the arcades, and the arcades always had that style monitor. So I always use those scan lines when I'm playing those games on a flat panel. Or to be honest, even like in my setup here, I have a Sony Trinitron with all of my 15 kilohertz only consoles. And then I have an NEC XM29 with anything that could also do 480p, as well as a Neo Geo, because the XM29 has that styled tube, which feels like a Neo Geo cab to me. Just my preference. There's no right or wrong way, by the way. But also stuff like Game Boy Advance. Yes, I would want the LCD pixel grid instead. And I understand why you might like to do that with the Switch because you're kind of emulating using the Switch in handheld modes. That also makes sense. So yeah, I'm all over the place with those different games, different content. And I really haven't had time yet to sit there and tweak the perfect combo. And I also think next year is going to be the year I upgrade my TV. I really, really love that one, but I could use a slightly bigger one down here. And it is going to be 9 years old. So I want to buy a TV when I've saved up money to buy a TV, not when this one randomly dies one day, 2 days before a party or something like that, or a football Sunday where I have to now run to the store and pay full price. So I should be an adult and stay on top of this. But so yeah, I think once I buy whatever my next TV is going to be, I think after getting the TV itself calibrated, I think I'm going to basically just spend some time really sitting there with the Tink 4K and dialing in different settings for different scenarios. What about a Blu-ray going to 4K with those CRT filters on it? How can I mix BFI into all of this? What are the combos? Because when you add BFI, it's darker. So I kind of, what's the refresh rates? I really want to dig into that and kind of figure out what's the best thing for each. And that's probably going to be months of testing. But when I'm done, you bet I'm going to do a video on it and hopefully be able to teach everybody how to dial it in on their set. But one of the biggest issues is, I think the biggest issues is that, right now I have a 65-inch OLED TV behind that pile of boxes, and it's like 7 or 8 feet from where it's probably a little more than that from my head to the screen. If I switched that out with a 77-inch TV and mounted it on the wall, that's going to be a different look. So dialing in those scan lines to get them just right is going to be different. So that settings for the 65 won't apply. So I would really not have to teach you what settings to use, but how to go about testing it. And sometimes you get color issues, especially if you do the RGB the RGB scan line emulation on there. You could change the color of the panel when you do that. Not permanently either, but So that's another thing that I would have to really dig into. And the goal of this for me is always to make it so that you can't really see the scan lines unless you're actually looking for them. Because that's the other problem I always ran into is I'll end up really concentrating on the look of the scan lines, and then I'll go, oh yeah, now it's distracting from the look of whatever I'm trying to watch on that. The goal of having a scanline effect is to make it feel like you're just watching a CRT. And when you're watching a CRT, you're not staring at the scan lines unless you're doing analysis or anything like that. So that's the other thing that's kind of hard to get across in the explanations and the videos that I do. You really just want to make it to a point that if somebody walking in the room wouldn't even notice they're on, but if you turn them off, people will go, "Oh, the pixels look too blocky," or that, why can I all of a sudden see all of this film grain that I couldn't see before that was blending in so nicely into the background?" So yeah, that's kind of my goal for scanlines, but that's a huge undertaking, and maybe somebody like Firebrand X will get to it before me, because to be blunt, he'll probably do a better job than I would anyway. So we'll see. Well, that's it for this time. Weren't too many questions this week, so whenever there aren't as many, I tend to ramble a little bit longer because I always try to find that sweet spot of having a fun conversation without wasting your time. I often don't hit it and talk too much, but I'm always trying my best. So any feedback you have, the more polite the feedback, the more of a chance I'll listen. I'm only human. If you come at me guns blazing, I might just skim right past the comment. But I'm trying my best with these. Also, if you have any question that you would like, please ask wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. The way the services work, it's really hard to figure out what's a new question on an older post. Plus, as you saw today, I like just scrolling through the different services and answering questions as if we were hanging out at an expo. Shameless plug for Retro World Expo next month, or just a coffee shop or a bar or something. I really like these to be laid back. So, and of course, and as always, thanks to everybody who supports in absolutely any way, because it really is you who's keeping all this stuff going. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next week.